This week on the Communicators, FCC Chairman Kevin Martin discusses a variety of issues, including the transition to digital television, the Commission's decision on Comcast, Indecency, and the future of the FCC.
Well, we're pleased to welcome to this edition of the Communicators the Chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, Kevin Martin. Chairman Martin, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks for having me.
A lot of issues we want to talk to you about that are in front of the FCC and working in the telecom world. Let's start with the digital transition. In just a few weeks, the city of Wilmington, North Carolina is going digital, the test market. Is the FCC ready for that, and is Wilmington ready?
Well, we hope so. I mean, that's part of the reason why we're engaging in this test, to make sure that we can see how prepared and how ready we are. And, you know, Commissioner Comcast had come up with the idea after he came back from a trip to the UK where they were rolling out their digital transition market by market, and he really suggested that he thought it'd be helpful if we went forward and had a test market somewhere. And we reached out to several of the different markets that we analyzed and estimated would be prepared. And Wilmington was willing to go first, and so we spent a lot of time making sure and educate all the consumers down there, working with the consumer groups and working with the consumer electronics folks to make sure that they're getting the boxes in the stores and people are prepared. And knock on wood, but hopefully everything's going to go all right down there.
What kind of effort has the FCC put forward in that?
Oh, well, we've put forth a significant effort in trying to make sure that all the consumers in Wilmington understand that this transition is going to be occurring several months before the transition in February. You know, a lot of the public service announcements and the other educational efforts that the industry is going through, both the broadcasters and the cable industry, to educate consumers about the upcoming transition, will continue to kick into high gear as we approach February. So as we convinced and talked to Wilmington about being willing to go first, we said we would spend a lot of time trying to help them educate their consumers about the upcoming transition that was going to occur down there and what steps the people needed to take to make sure they were prepared. And as you know, there's a variety of steps that consumers need to take if they want to continue to watch television. If they're an over-the-air subscriber, if they have rabbit ears or a rooftop antenna, they're going to either need to subscribe to a pay service like cable or satellite, or they'll have to buy a new digital television, or they'll have to go get a converter box. And if they get a converter box, then they'll make sure they hook it up appropriately and correctly. And so we've been spending a lot of time trying to educate consumers down there.
Are you satisfied with the education effort that the broadcasters and the cable industry have made to educate consumers?
Well, I certainly think that the industries have put forth a lot of resources to begin educating consumers, and I think that we've certainly had a significant increase in the awareness of the upcoming transition. You know, a year ago, most of the public surveys and estimates said that about 35% of the people were aware of the upcoming transition. The most recent surveys have now said within the last year, you've got that awareness up to somewhere in the mid-80s. So I think that it's a significant increase in the awareness of the upcoming transition. But that doesn't mean there isn't still work to do. We've got to make sure we continue to educate everyone about the upcoming transition, and we have to make sure that everyone not only understands what's going to happen, but what steps they need to do to make sure they're prepared.
Have the federal monies given toward the transition been enough?
Well, you know, we've gone back and asked for additional monies for public education. The Commission had actually asked for money for several years in our budget for public education about the upcoming transition. We received a little bit of money in this past year's budget. We've gone back and we asked Congress to be able to use some of our unspent monies in the past. We have an extra $12 million that we haven't spent in our past budgets over the last few years. We actually went back and asked Congress to authorize us to reappropriate that for consumer education, and they granted that this summer. So we've still got one more congressional request up there for some additional monies, but at least we've been able to get some additional resources, and we've been pleased with the support we've gotten recently.
And finally, Chairman Martin, do you see other test markets before the February 2009 full transition?
Well, we haven't had any volunteers yet. If there's any other markets that would be willing to end up volunteering for a full transition test, we certainly welcome it. And as I said, our engineers analyzed and said there were somewhere between 8 and 12 markets that they thought were potentially ready to undergo an early transition. We contacted the broadcasters in all of those communities, and we were only able to talk to Wilmington about actually going forward, and Wilmington was the only market in which the broadcasters were willing to go forward with this transition. But there may be the opportunity to try to do some other mini-tests. You know, some of the other commissioners have encouraged us to see if we can work with some of the markets to, while they won't do a full shut-off, to maybe do potential shorter-term shut-offs to emphasize the upcoming transition to the people that are living in those markets. So I think there could be some other things we're going to do, but I don't think there'll be another full test market like Wilmington is.
Well, another issue that is seemingly always in front of the FCC is that issue of indecency. Just recently, the courts, you lost another court case when it came to indecency, the Janet Jackson case. Are you planning on appealing that?
Well, we haven't made a final decision on it, but obviously we were disappointed with the outcome in the Janet Jackson decision. That's an instance in which there were hundreds of thousands of complaints that we received, and viewers that were concerned about what had occurred in the Super Bowl with the Janet Jackson incident. It was one of the incidents we've had the most complaints about, and indeed it helped prompt Congress to increase our fining authority. So it would be somewhat ironic if they prompted them to increase our fining authority, but the courts actually said we weren't able to fine them for that instance anyway. But we're still considering our options.
When it comes to hearing from the public, besides Indecency, what else do you hear from them on?
Well, we hear from the public on a variety of issues, certainly on, media and almost anything that touches the media, because it has such an impact on people's lives, is one of the things we most frequently hear from people complaining about or just concerned about. So Indecency is one of those, but media ownership, we heard a significant number of people, average citizens, wrote to the commission and contacted us and the concerns they had about media consolidation, and wanted to make sure that we understood that they had some concerns. We've increasingly heard people concerned about whether or not they might have some of their access to the internet blocked or degraded by some of the network operators, and that's been an issue that's gotten a lot of consumer attention. So there's several other issues that people are concerned about.
Well, two you've mentioned. I want to start with media ownership. Can we expect to see further FCC action in the next 6-7 months on media ownership?
Well, I think that the Commission took some important steps last year to update our rules and recognize the fact that the newspaper broadcast cross-ownership ban was the only rule that had actually never been changed since it had been put in place in the 1970s. Most of the other media ownership limits the Commission had actually been updated in the late 1990s after the 1996 Act was passed. The newspaper ban was the only rule that we had never actually gotten around to updating. And indeed, when the Commission had attempted to revise its media ownership rules several years ago, and it had been overturned by the Third Circuit, that court at the time, one of the only changes they upheld was our elimination of the newspaper broadcast cross-ownership ban. So we had to come up with a new framework. And I think that was an important step to update our rules and recognize the dramatically increasing pressure that the newspaper industry is under in trying to continue to gather news, which is at times a very expensive endeavor, and trying to be able to take those news gathering costs and spread them out over other platforms could be important to be able to continue to gather news. So I think we took some important steps to try to address it, but I don't anticipate the Commission will take any other steps on media ownership in the next few months.
Well, you also mentioned network management as one of the issues that you hear from people on. Recently, you had a case against Comcast where you sanctioned Comcast for its network management practices, and the vote was 3-2, you and the 2 Democrats versus the 2 Republicans. Was the vote, in your view, was this an affirmation of the net neutrality standard?
I think it was an affirmation of the position that I've been advocating since this issue has first arisen, that I think it is important to protect consumers' ability to access any internet content that they want, to be able to utilize any applications on the internet they want, to be able to ultimately use any kind of equipment, attach it if it doesn't do any harm to the network. Those are principles that I've actually supported and that the Commission has adopted. But at the same time, what I've said is that I didn't think that we needed any further legislation or any further rulemaking, because we could take action against any actor or against any operator who was actually trying to stifle the consumer's ability to access the internet. And so I think it was an affirmation of the approach where we can have these principles and enforce them through adjudications and individual complaints, like we do in other areas. And so I think that this is an appropriate balance that we've got to draw to recognize we want the network operators to continue to invest in their networks, but that they can't use those networks as a chokehold to prevent people from getting access to the internet.
Well, as you probably know, Minority Leader Boehner in the House wrote to you about this action, and here's one thing he said, and I want to get your response to this. Your heavy-handed attempts to inject the FCC into the middle of that process threaten to hijack the evolution of the internet to everyone's detriment. It will also deter the very broadband investment we need for the internet to continue growing to meet the increasing demands being placed upon it.
Well, I guess I'd have a couple responses to that. Obviously, I take seriously the considerations of the Minority Leader Boehner, but I would say first there were several network operators that actually supported the Commission taking action in this case. They didn't go into the facts of whether they supported our outcome, but they thought it was important we do respond to the complaints. And I think that's one thing that's important. And they are the same networks operators that would be concerned about investing in their networks so they can build out the next generation of broadband services. But I also think that it's important to remember that in the context of the network neutrality debate you were asking me about before, it was actually myself and other Republican leaders in Congress who said that there was no legislation that was necessary because the Commission had all the authority it needed to enforce its current network neutrality principles. And they actually said that they didn't need additional network neutrality legislation and that the Commission could and would take steps if any consumers were being, their access to the Internet was being blocked or in some way impeded. And I think in that context we actually had a complaint that followed through with exactly that problem. And I think that it was important for us to respond to those complaints in that manner.
Ted Hearn, who writes for Multichannel News, which is a cable industry trade paper, writes this about the vote and about John Boehner's letter. He says that Kevin Martin has teamed up with the two FCC Democrats mainly to be able to barrage cable operators and programmers with new regulations. Is that a fair statement in your view?
No, I think it's important for the Commission to respond to the complaints that we get in front of us. You know, when the Comcast and Time Warner Adelphia transaction was in front of us several years ago, the Commission actually explicitly put in that order when we were approving that if Comcast or Time Warner tried to block consumers or degrade consumers' access to the Internet in any way, they could complain to us and we would take action on those complaints. And in this instance, we had people complain to us, and when we did an investigation, and we had a very thorough investigation, 2 public hearings, numerous people testifying. We actually opened up our testimony to public comment, and we determined that actually they were impeding consumers' access to certain kinds of applications on the Internet. And actually, contrary to their initial assertions, they ultimately admitted that they were doing that. And I think that was actually one of the most troubling aspects of this case, was actually the fact that Comcast was really denying it and hiding it from their own customers, what they were actually doing. And that's why I thought it was so important for us to take action, and I welcome the support of any of the commissioners who agreed with me.
What will be the sanctions against Comcast? What will happen to the company?
Well, first and foremost, and I think the most important thing is we've told them they have to actually disclose what limits they're placing on their own customers. And I think and disclose it to us and disclose it to their customers. And I think that's reflective of just how important it is that we all understand any limitations that are being placed on them. We've also told them they have to stop the practice on a going forward basis, and we've asked them to file with us within 30 days a plan for how they will shut off any of the equipment that they have that have been engaging in this practice by the end of the year.
Is a la carte still alive and well, in your view?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by alive
issue?
and well. I think it's an important issue now, and I will think it will continue to be an important issue as long as you have cable rates increasing at the dramatic rate that they have. You know, over the last decade, cable rates have doubled, while almost every other communication service, the prices have gone down. You know, and I think it's important to understand that as a result of competition that's occurred in the communications landscape that was unleashed by the 1996 Telecommunications Act, what we've seen is in terms of consumer benefit is increasing innovation and decreasing prices for consumers. So that wireless rates are down, international calling rates are down, local telephone rates are down. The one exception to all of that is, of course, cable rates. Cable rates have almost doubled in the last decade. And I think that that's in part the problem of an ever-increasing bundle of channels that consumers are forced to buy. And one of the problems with that is that, according to Nielsen, consumers aren't watching a lot of those channels that they're buying. During the same time that the number of channels has doubled or maybe even tripled in some circumstances on that expanded basic tier, the number of channels that consumers are actually watching has only increased from about 14 or 15 to maybe 16 or 17. And I think that's a significant problem when consumers are only watching 15, 16, 17 channels, but they're being forced to buy a significant number of them at ever-increasing prices.
AT&T Wireless has just announced that it is not going to allow peer-to-peer transactions on its wireless network. What's your take on that?
Well, one of the things that I think is important about the Commission trying to deal with these peer-to-peer issues and these network neutrality and network management issues on a case-by-case basis is it allows us to take into account the exact facts of what they've announced, whether it is a discriminatory or non-discriminatory kind of an action, and what are the limitations on their network or the unique aspects of their network configuration. And so I think that one of the things that was important about the kind of cautious approach the Commission put forth in the Comcast item is it will allow us to consider the facts if people complain about some of the other issues. And we actually do have a wireless complaint. It's not about that, excuse me, but we do have one about Verizon last fall had not provided some of its short codes to some public advocacy groups, and they had complained, and some people had filed a complaint with the Commission about that, and the Commission's also investigating that. So we'll deal with similar wireless complaints as well.
Well, let's stick with broadband for a minute. We're talking with Kevin Martin, Chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. In Newsweek, in Business Week this week, there's an article about broadband and a proposal that you want the Commission to vote on this August, this month, regarding universal broadband in America. What is that proposal?
Well, what I had put forth was a plan that said that in the next auction that we were going to conduct, there's some additional frequencies that could be potentially utilized for wireless broadband services, that we should make a condition of that license, that whoever won the license, they should be required to provide a baseline basic broadband service to everyone throughout the country, and that they could do it on they could offer that on a free service. There are several companies that actually came to us and suggested that this might be a way to help us close the broadband gap. Broadband needs to be available throughout the country, and I think that wireless technologies is a good way to try to help close that broadband gap, particularly in rural areas where it can be very costly to build out wireline infrastructure. But no matter what technology you're using, cost can sometimes still be a barrier to people, particularly lower income people, from being able to utilize broadband. But increasingly, broadband is actually something that's going to be critical for almost every aspect of our lives. It's increasingly used for how we and utilized to help educate our children. It's going to have an impact on where and when we can work, and increasing productivity. It certainly is going to have an impact in increasing the future on how healthcare can be delivered and how our health can be monitored. And so to make sure that we're trying to close that broadband gap, I've proposed that we include a condition on our next auction of this spectrum that can be utilized for broadband services that would say, they should provide some baseline, basic, lifeline broadband service. And I think that would be important to help us make sure that everyone has access to at least the basics of broadband.
Do you have majority support yet for that proposal?
I don't know, but I'm not. I would tell you, contrary to what some people think, I'm never sure if I have majority of support for almost all my proposals when I put them forth. But I continue to believe that if they are the right proposals, and you continue to advocate them, you work hard at trying to make your colleagues understand why you think it's important, and I work with all my colleagues to try to address the concerns they might have to try to build a consensus and build a majority support for it. But I don't know.
What about federal monies for universal broadband?
The Commission gives out a significant amount of money already in our universal service program. We give out several $billions a year to hook up schools and libraries and provide them with broadband access. And we also give out even more money to the rural program to make sure that people that live in rural areas can stay connected and have the same basic kind of service as people that live in urban areas. Increasingly, that's no longer a voice-grade connection, but a broadband connection. And so I think we also need to reform our universal service policies so that we can more accurately target our resources, not just to voice-grade connections, but really to broadband connections. And I think that's also an important part of how we need to make sure we close that broadband gap.
A lot of studies show that the U.S. is 10th, 15th in the world when it comes to broadband availability and speed. Is that saying that our market approach that we've had so far is not working?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that what you've seen is actually a dramatic increase as we've removed regulatory barriers to people investing in their networks, and you've seen increasing competition particularly among the cable platform and among the telephone company platform, even in terms of DSL services or the Verizon rolling out their fiber to the home Fios service. But what I do think it demonstrates is actually the difference in the demographics in the United States. When you're talking about comparing the United States to countries abroad, you have to take into account, for example, how densely populated those countries are, and how densely populated their cities are, and what percentage of their population live in just a few cities that it becomes much easier to hook up. And when you take into account population density, actually, I think that you can see that the United States is not as far behind as those studies would all seem to indicate. For example, if you look at individual states in the United States that are more densely populated, and compare those to countries abroad that are also more densely populated, you see that actually our broadband subscription rates are much closer. So that if you look at, for example, a state like Massachusetts and New Jersey, for example, they have much higher population densities and much higher broadband penetration rates, just like countries that are similarly situated like Korea and Japan. And I think that explains a lot of the differences. But to some degree, it doesn't matter where we are in any kind of a ranking. The important part, from my vantage point, is making sure that everybody has access to broadband technologies. As I said a few minutes ago, increasingly it is going to be utilized for almost every aspect of our lives. And so regardless of the reason why, I think what's important is to focus on how we solve that broadband gap. And I think it's going to take a multifaceted approach. And it's going to take some creativity in making sure that we take the universal service monies that we already have and utilize them more effectively and more efficiently and move away from a voice grade connection to a broadband connection. It's going to take us thinking about how can we use spectrum, which is a more efficient technology in many rural high-cost areas. How can we use that to connect people throughout the country who don't have access to it now? How can we use our Lifeline and Link Up program, which is explicitly reserved for low-income consumers? How can we use that and transform that from a wireline connection to a wireless and a mobile and ultimately a broadband connection? And I think it's going to take creativity on all those fronts.
Chairman Martin, as you know, Joe Barton and the chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee have called for reorganization or restructuring of the FCC, and both have been relatively critical of your leadership. What's your response to them?
Listen, I try to work with both Chairman Dingell in the House and Chairman Inouye in the Senate, and also the Republican leadership of both committees. And we try to be responsive and work with them on both policy issues and on the processes going forward. And we try to end up being responsive to them on any concerns they have, and will continue to be.
What's your relationship with Joe Barton, the ranking Republican?
Oh, I mean, I try to, as I said, I try to work with both the Republican and Democrats up on the Hill, just like I try to work with Republicans and Democrats at the Commission.
Is the FCC structured or organized in a way to meet the 21st century technology and issues that we're facing?
Well, I think it's always a challenge. I mean, things are happening and changing so rapidly in terms of the changes in technology that are occurring. I think it certainly puts a strain on a decision-making process, particularly for a deliberative administrative body that's required to actually build a consensus among 5 different individuals. But I think that there's a lot of benefits to having an administrative body as well. This is a bipartisan agency by law. So that means you have to have Republicans and Democrats on the commission, and that also means that you bring a variety of different perspectives. And one of the things that I continue to try to put forth whenever I'm trying to solve these difficult issues is I put forth what I think is the best proposal and the best solution to many of these challenging problems. But then you've got to go make sure you try to work with all your other colleagues to get them to engage with you and determine whether or not they agree and support the proposals you put forth. And each one of them brings a different and unique perspective. And oftentimes we can try to incorporate that, and I'll even work with the commissioners even after I've secured a majority vote to see if people have ways that they think that they can improve the item. I don't just stop once I get a majority. We continue to work to see how we can make it better so that everyone can support it.
If you could restructure the FCC, would you add members? How would you do it? Would you change how the meetings are mandated?
Oh, I mean, I think that the most important change that you could make at the Commission would be to remove the restrictions that don't allow us to meet as a group except at an open public meeting. That really prohibits the 5 commissioners, even if the requirement was we had to meet with all 5 of us there. That prohibits us from getting together and having a more open dialogue about these issues and being able to understand and actually listen to what the concerns the other commissioners have as a group. We might be able to build consensus and be able to achieve some decision making at times faster. So I think that's one significant change that I would certainly advocate.
And you can imagine that when people hear that we'd like to meet all together in private without anybody watching, people might have a negative reaction to that.
I think that absolutely, I think that's a concern, and that's one of the reasons why we've had the sunshine laws in place. But I would even say I don't have a problem with the commissioners still having to take the final vote in public and explain their rationale and letting all the commissioners have an open proceeding. But I think prohibiting us from even discussing the issues without doing so in an open an open meeting with giving people 7 days advance notice and having to do it in the open meeting room probably does stifle, a full and honest kind of dialogue and discussion among the commissioners.
You have 5-6 months left in your chairmanship?
Well, I've got several years left at the commission.
At the commission, but in the chairmanship.
Well, you serve at the chairman at the discretion of the president.
Okay. So, what can we expect as an agenda for the next 4 months?
I think you'll see an agenda that continues forth with many of the same policies and principles and goals that I've been working on since I've been chairman, and I think we'll continue to be active on a whole host of issues. One of the things that I've worked a lot on is making sure that we improve our public safety communications, whether that's in making sure that the public safety officials have access to the next generation of technologies and services so we can solve kind of the interoperability challenges. We tried to work on that in the context of our 700 megahertz auction. I think you'll see the commission focus over the next few months on how we can put forth a new proposal on that. I think the commission will continue to try to work on issues like 911 location accuracy and what we can do to make sure that when people pick up any kind of phone and dial 911, they can get a hold of the local police, the local fire department, and the local police and local fire department can find them. I think we continue to see us working very hard on the first topic you raised with me, the DTV transition. That's going to be a big challenge for the commission between now and next February, making sure that we're educating consumers on what's about to happen, what steps they need to take, making sure that the broadcasters are all positioned so that they're prepared for this upcoming transition. And you'll continue to see us working on issues as it relates to encouraging companies to deploy the next generation of infrastructure and protecting consumers' access to content over broadband services. I think that both consumer protection and encouraging, facilitating a level playing field among the competitors in broadband, I think will continue to be important.
Are you happy with the number of competitors in broadband?
Oh, I think you always want to end up facilitating and encouraging more. I mean, we've got, as I said, a broadband marketplace that has a vibrant competition between the cable platform and the telephone platform in terms of DSL or FiOS. And we've increasingly are going to be focused on facilitating wireless broadband platform. The wireless broadband platform is an additional competitor in all of those, in each and every market. And I think finding additional competitors is going to be important going forward.
What's the philosophy behind your decisions or behind your views?
I think that it's grounded in a fundamental belief that most of the time the marketplace will be able to provide the best services, best protector of consumers in terms of driving innovation further, driving prices ultimately down. But that doesn't mean that the government doesn't have an important role to play. The government has a very important role to play in setting up the ground rules so that the different companies and different platforms can compete on a level playing field, so that when the cable companies and when the telephone companies and when the wireless companies are all providing these broadband services, they're all able to compete on a level playing field. And I think we've implemented that by removing many regulatory obstacles to that kind of an approach. We've tried to streamline the franchising obligations, for example, for telephone companies to deploy video services to compete with cable companies. We've also made sure that cable companies can take advantage of interconnecting in with telephone companies and utilizing the number portability so their customers can move over and keep their same numbers to allow for competition. And then I think you have to recognize that there are sometimes greater social or public obligations that the government may want to ensure that won't be achieved by the marketplace alone. And I think that public safety is a good example of that. And I think the government has to take a much more aggressive role in ensuring that there's a certain minimum baseline level of public safety that's being provided by these communications networks. And that's why I thought it was so important for us to respond and make sure that voice over IP networks, network operators were going to be providing 911, the steps we've taken on making sure that wireless carriers had location accuracy improvements to make sure that public safety officials can find them, what we've done on trying to solve interoperability for public safety communications. I think all of those are important. And I think that if you get that mix right, I think that ultimately you're going to end up with a communications landscape that both has a balance and provides an incentive for network operators to invest in their networks, and at the same time protects consumers' access to all the benefits of that.
Would you stay on the commission at this point under President Obama or President McCain?
Oh, I think that
even not as chairman.
I don't have any plans to go anywhere at this time, and at this point, I'm still focused on continuing to work hard over the next few months and make sure we can address just as many issues as we can here at the commission.
Knowing what you know about Senators McCain and Obama, would their approach to telecommunications issues be different than President Bush's? Would the emphasis be different?
I think that certainly I think that every president would come in and have their own different emphasis on the issues that come forth. And I've worked closely at times in the past. I mean, Senator McCain was the chairman of the Commerce Committee when I was a commissioner, and so I've worked with him in the past. And indeed, we actually wrote a joint op-ed one time on the issues of a la carte and the potential benefits of that for consumers to be able to pick and choose their channels and help lower their cable rates.
Kevin Martin is chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. Thank you for being on the Communicators.
Thanks. I appreciate it.